Clara Whitmore's hands trembled as she gripped the worn leather steering wheel of her car, its engine humming softly as it climbed the winding road that led to Whitmore Manor. The trees lining the driveway were wild now, their branches stretching like ghostly arms reaching for the sky. What was once a stately entrance, framed by neatly trimmed hedges and lanterns that illuminated the way, was now shadowed and overgrown. She barely recognized it. The sight of the grand estate, once bustling with life and pride, now decaying in silence, sent a cold shiver down Clara's spine. She hadn't set foot in Whitmore Manor in years, not since she fled at 17, desperate to escape the shadows of her family's legacy. Yet, as the faded pillars of the estate came into view, memories flooded her, both sweet and bitter. Mother's laugh echoing through the halls, the scent of freshly baked cookies in the kitchen, the soft click of the family's antique grandfather clock in the hallway. But now all of it felt distant, tainted by time. The weight of her mother's death still hung over her, like a fog that wouldn't lift. Clara had hoped returning to the manor would bring closure, but instead it felt like reopening a wound that had never quite healed. There was no more warmth in the walls, no comfort in the old furniture. Everything seemed hollow, as if the house itself was grieving, mourning a past that could never be revived. Clara parked near the front door, the sound of the gravel crunching under the tires far louder than it should have been. She took a deep breath and slowly opened the car door, her boots sinking into the damp earth as she stepped out. The manor loomed before her, its towering silhouette casting long shadows across the lawn. She could almost hear the faint whispers of the past, as though the house itself was trying to speak to her. The wind rustled through the ivy that clung desperately to the stone walls, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw a figure in one of the upper windows, watching her. She shook her head, dismissing it as a trick of the light. With a heavy heart, Clara approached the front door, its once polished brass handle now tarnished, barely clinging to the doorframe. The sound of the door creaking as she pushed it open was jarring, the silence of the house inside oppressive. The air smelled of dust and mildew, the scent of neglect hanging thick in the air. Stepping into the foyer, Clara's eyes lingered on the grand staircase that once symbolized the height of Whitmore prestige. But now the banister was chipped and splintered, the carpet threadbare from years of wear. She ran her fingers along the railing, feeling the coolness of the wood under her touch, but it did nothing to comfort her. The house had aged just as she had, but unlike her, the manor had been left to wither, forgotten by all except the few who still clung to the past. Clara knew she had to sell it. The estate was too far gone to save, and her mother had left no choice. But even with the decision already made, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that returning here, to this house of faded memories, meant more than just a sale. It was as if the manor was holding something back, a secret that had remained buried, hidden beneath the layers of dust and decay. She moved through the house slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The walls seemed to close in around her, each room more suffocating than the last. It was as if the house was resisting her, unwilling to let go of its history, unwilling to allow Clara to move on. And Clara couldn't help but wonder if it was more than just the manor that was unwilling to let go. Maybe it was the family that lived here too. The thought was fleeting, but unsettling. There was something about this place, something that whispered that not all was as it seemed. As Clara entered her mother's old bedroom, she paused. The room was exactly as it had been when she left. The delicate lace curtains still fluttered gently in the breeze from the cracked window. The four-poster bed, though worn with age, still commanded the room. On the vanity, Clara could see the faint reflection of her own face in the dusty mirror, but it was the pile of letters on the desk that caught her attention. Her heart skipped a beat. Among the piles of forgotten paperwork, one envelope stood out, sealed, with her name written in elegant handwriting, "To my firstborn." Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the letter, every instinct in her telling her to turn away. But she couldn't. Not now, not when the air around her seemed thick with the presence of unanswered questions. The house, Clara realized, wasn't just resisting her. It was waiting for her to uncover the truth. Clara's fingers hesitated over the envelope, its presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. "To my firstborn." The words were unmistakable, written in the looping, familiar script of her mother's handwriting, but the sight of them made Clara's heart race with unease. She had always been the firstborn, or so she had been told, the golden child, the one her mother had built her life around, the one who would carry the Whitmore name forward, just as it had been passed down for generations. But this was different. Why hadn't her mother ever mentioned such a letter? Why had it been hidden here, tucked away in a drawer of old papers she had never thought to examine? It seemed impossible that her mother, who had always been meticulous and precise, would keep such an important letter a secret, unless it was something too dangerous to ever reveal. Clara turned the envelope over in her hands, studying the seal. It was unbroken, the wax still glistening darkly in the dim light filtering through the dust-coated window. She could feel her pulse quickening. There was no way around it. She had to open it. Whatever this letter held, it would answer questions she had never even dared to ask. With a sharp breath, Clara broke the seal, pulling out the single sheet of yellowed paper within. She unfolded it carefully, the crackling of the old paper loud in the stillness of the room. The scent of ink and age wafted up, mingling with the stale air. She held her breath as she began to read. "My dearest Clara, I write this letter as a confession, one I hope you can one day understand. You were not the firstborn, though I have raised you as such. The truth, my love, is far more complicated than you could ever have known." Clara's hands faltered, the words blurring as her mind raced. Her firstborn? She wasn't the firstborn? She read the words again, the shock of them sinking in. How could this be? Her mother had always spoken to her like she was the heir to the Whitmore legacy, the firstborn, the one meant to carry on the family name. But as she read on, the letter revealed more. Before you, there was another child, a daughter, born to me and to Silas, our groundskeeper, during a time when such things could never be allowed. Our affair, though true and filled with love, was forbidden by the world we lived in, and the child that resulted from it was never meant to see the light of day. I regret to tell you this, but she was declared stillborn, Clara. For the sake of the family name, for the sake of Whitmore Manor, we had no choice but to pretend she never existed. Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. A sister. A hidden sister. The words on the page seemed to mock her understanding of everything she had ever known about her family. Her mother had a child with Silas, the black groundskeeper, and that child had been erased, buried beneath the weight of shame and social pressures. She is gone now, lost to the world and to the family. But I write this now, because I fear you must know. There was, and still is, another Whitmore, your older sister, and the inheritance, the one that we have both fought so hard for, was never meant to be yours. It is hers. If she is alive, Clara, she will inherit all that the Whitmore name holds. And you will have nothing. Clara dropped the letter, the words spinning in her mind like a storm. Her chest tightened, her breathing shallow. She had to be mistaken. This had to be some kind of sick joke. Her mother, the woman who had raised her, the woman who had built their world together, could not have kept such a monumental truth from her, could not have let her grow up believing she was the rightful heir when someone else was meant to take her place. Her mind raced back to the times her mother had spoken of her own childhood, of the Whitmore family's noble history, of the legacy of their name passed down from generation to generation. It had all been a lie. The wealth, the reputation, the expectations, all built on the silencing of a child, a sister who had never had a chance. Clara's stomach churned. She couldn't breathe. She staggered back from the desk, her head spinning. The walls of the room seemed to press in around her, suffocating her. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, your older sister. The inheritance was never meant to be yours. Was this true? Was there someone else out there? Someone who had been hidden away, erased from the family history? And if so, where were they now? Clara's mind was awash with 1,000 questions, each one darker than the last. But one thing was certain. Everything she thought she knew about her family, about her own identity, had just been shattered. And with it came a terrifying realization. Her life, her future, was no longer in her control. The Whitmore name, the legacy, the inheritance, they were no longer hers to claim. The letter, now crumpled in her hand, felt like a lifeline to a past she could never reclaim. Clara had always believed she was the heir to everything, but now she had to wonder, what if she wasn't? Clara sat on the edge of the bed, the letter from her mother still clenched tightly in her hand. The weight of the words had sunk deep into her chest, making each breath feel like it was coming from a place far away. Her mother had always been the person she thought she knew best, but now, Clara realized, the woman who had raised her was a stranger in the most intimate sense. There had been a life, an entire chapter of her mother's existence hidden from her. The letter had suggested so much more, but Clara needed to know more, the full, ugly truth. The mention of the firstborn daughter Silas and the faked stillbirth, she could hardly believe it. And yet, as the minutes ticked by, Clara's resolve hardened. She had to find out if the child really was dead, or if the lie had run deeper, if her mother's words could somehow be disproven. She could no longer live with the nagging feeling that something had been stolen from her. With shaky hands, Clara pushed herself to her feet and made her way to the study. Her mother's old papers were neatly stacked in the desk drawers, and her pulse quickened at the thought of uncovering anything that might explain the strange secrecy surrounding the past. As she sifted through the cluttered drawers, Clara's eyes fell on an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The name, Evelyn Whitmore, was etched in gold across the cover. It was her mother's journal. She opened the journal slowly, the familiar scent of ink and paper filling her senses. The first pages were filled with mundane entries about daily life, family gatherings, and the challenges of maintaining the estate. But as Clara turned the pages, the entries began to shift, becoming darker, more cryptic. One entry in particular caught her attention. The night I saw her, I thought I was losing my mind. Silas's child. No one could know. The family would never allow it. What was I supposed to do? The child, a girl, had a future that could never be. I knew I was making the hardest choice of my life, but it was for the good of everything. She was born that night, and then she was gone. I never saw her again. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. A girl, her sister, the child that had been born and then erased, hidden in plain sight, was real. But the diary offered no explanation for what had happened to her. The words were carefully chosen, as if her mother were afraid of revealing too much. Flipping ahead in the journal, Clara found another entry. The funeral is tomorrow. The baby will be buried in the Whitmore plot, just as if she had never been. No one will question it, no one will remember her name. They'll never know what I did to protect this family. It's a secret I will carry to my grave. Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight with the implications of the words. Her mother had been there at the burial. She had seen the child lowered into the ground, and yet she had never once spoken of it to Clara. The thought of her mother, the woman who had been her guiding light, participating in such an appalling cover-up, sent a cold chill down her spine. But it wasn't just the betrayal of her mother that cut deepest. The journal also spoke of an era, a time when a union between her mother and Silas, a black man, would have been deemed unforgivable. The Whitmore name, built on wealth and respectability, would never have survived such a scandal. Clara understood the motivations, but that didn't make it any easier to stomach. Her mind reeled as she thought back to her mother's death, the strange way she had clung to her pride, her insistence that nothing about their legacy should ever be questioned. It now seemed that this was all rooted in fear of being exposed, fear of losing everything. Clara needed to know more. The diary had given her some answers, but it also raised countless new questions. There had to be someone in the town who remembered something. Someone who had seen the child or heard whispers about her disappearance. Clara could feel the weight of the past pressing on her, suffocating her with every passing moment. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise from downstairs. She tensed, her body on high alert. She hadn't expected anyone to be here. The estate had been silent for so long. Slowly, Clara descended the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The floor creaked beneath her, the old wood groaning as if it too remembered the ghosts of the past. At the bottom of the stairs she froze. A figure stood in the doorway of the sitting room. A woman. Tall, with striking features that felt oddly familiar. She was dressed in a simple black dress, but there was something about the way she carried herself, something about her presence. that made Clara's heart race. The woman turned slowly, her eyes locking with Clara's. "Clara Whitmore, I presume," the woman said, her voice low and steady. Clara's mouth went dry. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "I'm your sister." The afternoon sun filtered weakly through the windows, casting a pale light across the old study. Clara sat at her mother's desk, the weight of the journal still heavy in her hands. The revelation of a sister, a life concealed for decades, felt like a dark cloud hanging over her. But there was no time to linger in shock. The truth she had already uncovered was just the beginning. Her eyes scanned the piles of papers scattered across the desk, each one a reminder of the legacy that was now in jeopardy. The Whitmore name had always been synonymous with power and respect, but those foundations were built on something far less honorable than Clara had ever imagined. And now, there was a new truth to contend with, one that could ruin everything. It was the will. Clara had found it hidden behind a row of dusty books, tucked away in a drawer her mother had never allowed anyone to open. It was yellowed with age, the ink smudged in places, but still legible. She had read it several times, the words blurring before her eyes each time, but there was no mistaking the clause that sent a chill down her spine. "In the event of my passing, the estate shall be inherited by my firstborn child, who will be responsible for preserving the Whitmore legacy and managing the assets of the estate. If said firstborn is deceased or unable to fulfill these duties, the estate shall pass to their immediate heir." The words seemed so simple, so clear, but the implication was devastating. Clara wasn't the firstborn. She wasn't even the eldest child, not by a long shot. The letter, the diary, and now the will all pointed to a different truth. The child her mother had hidden away, the one who had been erased from the family's history, was the rightful heir. And if she were still alive, Clara would be nothing more than an outsider in her own family. A cold shiver ran down Clara's spine. She was no longer certain what she had been raised to believe. The family she had trusted, the people she had thought she could depend on, had lied to her, manipulated her. The will made it clear that her mother's attachment to the estate had been tied to something far more self-serving than love for her children. The Whitmore name, the estate, the power, it had always been about control, about preserving an image. But there was more. The will, as it stood, had never been filed. Clara wasn't sure why. Maybe her mother had simply forgotten, or perhaps it had been deliberately hidden, kept from view to avoid the inevitable chaos that would follow. If the will was ever found, everything would change. Her hand trembled as she flipped through the papers. There, at the back, was a second, handwritten clause. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. Clara's heart thudded against her chest as she read it aloud to herself, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "If the firstborn child is proven to be alive and of sound mind, they shall inherit the estate in full. If the firstborn cannot be located, or if their existence is proven to be false, the estate will be divided among the remaining heirs at the discretion of the family patriarch." Clara's blood ran cold. The truth was undeniable now. If Lenora was really who she claimed to be, if the woman who had shown up claiming to be her sister was indeed the firstborn, Clara's entire inheritance, her entire claim to the Whitmore legacy would be erased. The estate, the wealth, the name, everything she had spent her life building toward would slip away from her fingers. The thought was unbearable. But Clara couldn't ignore the one burning question. If the firstborn child was still alive, why hadn't her mother ever mentioned her? Why had she gone to such great lengths to erase her existence from their lives, to protect the family name at all costs? Clara glanced at the ledger she had uncovered earlier, the one that detailed the family's wealth, built on blackmail, secrecy, and corruption. That alone was a damning piece of evidence. But now, with the will in her hands, Clara realized that the truth had always been a double-edged sword. It wasn't just about the family's fortune. It was about the power they held over everything, over everyone, including her. She stood up, her legs shaky beneath her, and walked to the window, staring out at the crumbling estate. The land that had once represented strength, history, and tradition now felt like a prison. Everything her family had built was held together by lies, and with each truth Clara uncovered, those lies unraveled a little more. Her phone buzzed suddenly, jolting her from her thoughts. She grabbed it, her hand still trembling, and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Lenora. "Clara, we need to talk. The truth can't stay buried anymore." Clara's throat tightened. She didn't know whether she was ready for this conversation, but there was no turning back now. Whatever had been hidden in the shadows for so long was coming into the light, and Clara had no choice but to face it head-on. The house groaned, its old wooden beams creaking under the weight of history as Clara paced the floor of the library. The sun had set hours ago, but the darkened room felt even colder as the night stretched on. The remnants of her mother's life were scattered around her, papers, personal effects, photographs, each one a reminder of the legacy Clara was about to lose. The discovery of the will had changed everything. But it was the ledger she had uncovered earlier that felt like the final nail in the coffin. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the Whitmore fortune than she had been told. More than just the crumbling estate, the disjointed family history, or even the painful secrets about the real firstborn. There was something darker, more insidious, buried beneath the surface. Clara flipped through the old financial ledger once more. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded in places, but the numbers and names were still clear enough to make her blood run cold. What she had first taken to be a record of estate holdings, property sales, and investments turned out to be something far worse. A meticulous account of blackmail, extortion, and manipulation. The Whitmore family's wealth, once thought to be built on land and business ventures, had actually been carefully constructed over decades of secrets and threats. Each page contained names, politicians, businessmen, and socialites, all linked to the Whitmores through a tangled web of blackmail. The amounts were staggering, but it was the names that caught her attention. High-profile individuals, people her family had worked with or had once admired, their reputations tarnished in exchange for quiet deals and confidential payouts. Clara's fingers trembled as she traced a series of figures, a sum of money that had been paid out for decades, with no clear reason or record of the transactions. One entry stood out among the rest: $250,000 paid to Mayor J.H. for quieting the land dispute. Additional funds to be released annually. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. Her grandmother's name was scribbled on the same page, alongside the mayor's, in a faded ink that matched her own mother's handwriting. The realization hit Clara like a wave. Her family's fortune wasn't just built on land and business savvy. It had been built on the exploitation of power, the manipulation of others for profit, and the complete destruction of anyone who stood in the way. Her breath caught as she turned the page, her eyes scanning the next set of entries. This time, there were records of more personal transactions, bribes to secure influence in the town, hush money to silence witnesses, and most chilling of all, a series of payments labeled "for services rendered" with a name she didn't recognize: Silas Jackson. Clara stared at the name for a long moment, the connection clicking into place. Silas Jackson had been the Whitmore family's groundskeeper, a black man her mother had once spoken about with little regard. But now the connection was undeniable. Silas had been more than just a servant. He had been involved in the family's dirty dealings, the very foundation of their wealth and power. He had been involved in their lies. Her hands clenched the pages in frustration. Was this why her mother had kept her true sister hidden away? Had Silas been involved with her mother in ways that had never been spoken of, that Clara had never been told about? It was all coming into focus. The secret affair, the stillborn child that wasn't stillborn at all. And now this. It wasn't just the family's reputation that had been shattered. It was everything. Clara slammed the ledger shut, her mind racing. She felt nauseous, betrayed by her own blood, by everything she had ever believed about the Whitmores. They were not the proud, powerful family she had grown up idolizing. They were criminals, liars, and manipulators who had built an empire on the backs of others. But this ledger, this evidence of their crimes, was the key. If Clara could prove it, expose it, the entire Whitmore legacy would be torn down. The estate would be lost, the money, the power, everything. But who could she trust? Could she even trust Lenora, the woman who claimed to be her sister? What if Lenora knew more than she was letting on, playing the same games her family had perfected over the years? Clara didn't know what to believe anymore, and with each step she took deeper into the tangled web of the Whitmore history, She could feel herself losing control. The truth was too dangerous, but it was also too powerful to ignore. Clara locked the ledger in the desk drawer and stood up, her mind already planning her next move. She had to find the truth, but at what cost? As she turned to leave the room, a sound broke the stillness of the house, the creak of floorboards in the hallway. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. Someone was here. Clara's heart thudded in her chest as she ventured deeper into the hidden recesses of Whitmore Manor. The house felt heavier tonight, as if it were alive, remembering its own dark past and pushing her further into its forgotten corners. The discovery of the ledger had shaken her to the core, but it was the diary that would reveal everything. Or so she hoped. It had taken hours of sifting through her grandmother's things before Clara found it, a leather-bound journal tucked beneath a pile of old letters, its once crimson cover faded with age. The diary had been hidden away as if someone had been determined to keep its contents from ever seeing the light of day. But Clara was beyond caring about secrets now. She needed answers, no matter the cost. With trembling hands, she opened the diary to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, familiar in a way that sent a chill up her spine. It was her grandmother's script, but the words felt foreign, tainted with the weight of guilt and years of concealed truths. The entries began innocuously enough, documenting the mundane details of daily life, but as Clara flipped through the pages, it became evident that something darker was unfolding within the carefully written lines. Her grandmother had chronicled every event of the family's life, but it was what lay between the lines that disturbed Clara the most. One passage, written in a hurried scrawl, caught her attention. "I cannot live with this. The lies must remain buried. The family will never survive the truth. He cannot be acknowledged. She must never be known." Clara's breath caught in her throat. He and she. The two figures who had haunted her family's history. Silas and the child. The firstborn. Her mother's child, declared stillborn all those years ago. As Clara continued reading, the entries grew more fragmented and the guilt began to seep through every word. Her grandmother's grip on reality had clearly started to slip, but the most disturbing part was a cryptic entry near the end of the diary. "The night by the well. I should never have done it. But what else could I do? The family's name would be destroyed. I must carry this secret to my grave." The night by the well. Clara stared at the phrase, the weight of its meaning crushing down on her. The well. It had been an old family landmark on the estate, a place where the Whitmores had gathered, a place where Clara's mother had often taken her when she was young. But why would her grandmother have referenced it here? What had happened that night? The entry hinted at something more than just a cover-up. It suggested a crime, one that had never been spoken of. Clara's fingers trembled as she turned the pages more frantically, desperate to understand. The diary shifted from entries about family events to something far darker, a confession. A series of disturbing admissions about Clara's grandmother's involvement in the conspiracy to hide the truth. Her grandmother had not only known about the affair between her mother and Silas Jackson, but she had actively participated in ensuring the baby's death was covered up. Clara's blood ran cold as she read about how her grandmother had orchestrated the fake stillbirth, making sure the child was buried in secret. There were references to money exchanged, to shady dealings with the doctor who had helped maintain the facade of a tragic loss. There was even mention of a burial plot. A plot not marked with a grave, but with a false tombstone that hid the true story from the world. But the most chilling revelation was the suggestion that Clara's grandmother had done more than just arrange the lies. It was hinted that the child's disappearance hadn't been a matter of death at all. The baby had been taken, hidden away to protect the Whitmore name. The firstborn had lived. But where had she gone? What had been done to her? Clara slammed the diary shut, her mind reeling from the implications. She could hardly believe what she had just read. But the evidence was clear. The Whitmore family had built their empire not just on wealth and deception, but on the complete erasure of a life, her sister's life. And now, this woman who had claimed to be her sister Lenora was at the heart of it all. Clara paced the room, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The estate had hidden too many truths, too many sins that needed to be confronted. But as much as she needed answers, she was scared to confront them. What if the truth about her grandmother's role in the cover-up wasn't the end? What if the secrets didn't end with her mother? A sudden thought struck Clara. What if her grandmother's diary wasn't the only source of information? What if someone else had known what happened that night? Someone else who could still be alive? Someone who might be watching her now? The house seemed to hold its breath, its walls pressing in as Clara stood frozen in the center of the room. She knew she couldn't leave it all behind. She had to dig deeper. And with each new discovery, the manor seemed less like a home and more like a tomb. With trembling hands, Clara placed the diary back in its hiding spot, her mind racing with the possibilities. She had to uncover the truth of the well, and whatever had been buried there. As she turned to leave, a soft noise echoed through the hallway again. Clara stiffened. Someone was here, and this time, she didn't think it was just her imagination. The knock at the front door was slow, measured, not loud enough to be urgent, but not timid either, like whoever was on the other side belonged there. Clara, still reeling from the revelations in her grandmother's diary, froze. Her pulse echoed in her ears. The knock came again. She moved through the dimly lit halls of Whitmore Manor, past portraits of solemn ancestors and dust-covered heirlooms that suddenly seemed to be watching her. When she reached the door and opened it, the storm of the past few days finally found a face. A woman stood on the front steps, tall, elegant, maybe in her mid-40s. She wore a tailored coat despite the warm spring air, her hair tightly coiled and pinned with precision. But it was her eyes, striking, amber-flecked, and painfully familiar, that made Clara stagger back. "I'm sorry," the woman said with a calm that sounded practiced. "You must be Clara. I'm Lenora." Clara gripped the doorframe, her voice caught somewhere between breath and disbelief. "I think there's been a mistake," she said. Lenora's gaze didn't waver. "I don't think there has." The silence between them stretched too long. "I was told I died," Lenora added softly, "on a cold February night in 1979. But I didn't. I've spent my whole life wondering why." The words hit Clara like a slap. She ushered Lenora into the grand foyer without thinking, and as the door closed behind them, it felt like the entire house exhaled, recognizing the ghost who had returned. They sat across from each other in the drawing room, the same room where Clara had once played tea party as a child, unaware her family tree had an entire branch hidden from her. Lenora's voice was low but steady as she recounted the trail that led her here. Whispers from a dying nurse, a forged birth certificate uncovered in probate records, and the same diary Clara had found referenced in county archives, though she hadn't been able to access it until now. Every breadcrumb, every buried detail had pointed back to Whitmore Manor. Back to Clara. Clara struggled to hold her composure as Lenora produced a packet of documents. Faded photos, letters signed by her mother, hospital bracelets that matched the date of the stillbirth. "I'm not here for revenge," Lenora said, "but I deserve to know what was taken from me." Clara wanted to believe her, but she'd grown up in a house built on lies and manipulation. She had been trained, maybe even groomed, to question sincerity when it came through the front door without an invitation. "How do I know any of this is real?" Clara asked. Lenora leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Because the wallpaper in the nursery had birds on it. Blue swallows. One of them had a crooked wing. You used to stare at it. And because my mother, our mother, used to sing the same song every night before bed. You are my sunshine." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. No one else would know that. Not unless it was true. A surge of emotion swelled in Clara's chest. Disbelief, wonder, fear, and something dangerously close to guilt. Had she been living someone else's life all this time? Was Lenora the rightful heir, not just to the estate but to the family name? But even as Clara reeled, another voice, her mother's, whispered in her mind, "Don't trust what walks through the gate uninvited." And Clara had to ask herself, had Lenora come to reclaim what was stolen, or to destroy what little remained? The test results came in a plain manila envelope, but it felt heavier than lead in Clara's hands. Her fingers trembled as she peeled back the flap and unfolded the document. 2 names, 2 matching strands of DNA, one undeniable truth. Lenora was her sister. The confirmation hit like thunder, loud and terrifying, even though deep down, Clara had known the moment Lenora sang that lullaby. There was no denying the echo of their mother in the woman's voice. or in her eyes. Still, reading the proof made it real. Unchangeably, legally, inescapably real. But real didn't mean simple. The news traveled fast, too fast, through the close-knit town that had always revered the Whitmores as a pillar of old money virtue. Now, their legend was unraveling at the seams. Town whispers turned to open stares. Friends stopped returning Clara's calls. Even the family lawyer, once doting, grew cold and formal. It wasn't just the shame of an illegitimate child, it was who the child had belonged to. The sins of Clara's mother were rippling into the present, disturbing the fragile web of Southern respectability that still lingered like moth-eaten lace. And then, someone died. It was Martha Kincaid, the last living maid who'd served at Whitmore Manor during the year Lenora was born. Her body was found at the edge of the estate, slumped against the base of an old pecan tree. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, just a bruised temple and a look of horror frozen on her face. The sheriff ruled it an accident. A fall. Maybe a stroke. But Clara had seen Martha just days before, sharp-tongued and fiery-eyed, warning her to stay away from old wounds you don't want bleeding. Lenora had been the last one seen speaking with her. Whispers turned to accusations. She had motive, someone said at the general store. She's the one with everything to gain. They say she was poking around, said another, asking questions about the old well. Clara tried to silence the rumors, but doubt crept in like ivy through cracked stone. Was it coincidence that the one person who might have confirmed or denied the truth about Lenora's birth was now dead? Lenora remained composed through it all. Maybe too composed. When Clara confronted her, voice raw and breaking, Lenora didn't lash out. She only said, "I've been lied to my whole life, Clara. I didn't come here to lie. But I'm not going to disappear just because it makes everyone more comfortable." And Clara believed her. Mostly. But in a family that had buried the truth once, beneath silence, shame, and a fake death certificate, how could she be sure? As the sun dipped below the tangled trees outside, casting long shadows through the manor's broken windows, Clara found herself asking a question she never thought she'd face. What if her sister's return wasn't just inconvenient, but dangerous? Because sometimes, blood isn't what binds a family, it's what stains it. The storm had rolled in just past midnight, sheets of rain hammering the roof as if the heavens themselves wanted to wash Whitmore Manor clean. Clara sat at her mother's desk, soaked in sweat and rainwater, her hands trembling as she held the weathered parchment she'd just pulled from behind a crumbling section of the library wall. It was the real will, dated just 2 months before her mother's death. It named both daughters as heirs, Clara and Lenora, equal in blood, equal in inheritance. The shock made her legs go numb. Not only had her mother known Lenora was alive, she'd planned to make it right, to share what had once been denied. But the revised will had never been filed with the court. It had been hidden, sealed behind plaster and brick, as if even in her dying days, their mother still feared the truth becoming public. Clara wasted no time. She snapped photos, called the lawyer, scheduled an emergency meeting for the following morning. For once, she felt clarity slicing through the fog of grief and confusion. She would fix this. She had to. But clarity was a fragile thing at Whitmore Manor. By dawn, the office was gone, reduced to charred timber and ash. The fire had started in the study, the same room where the will had been laid out the night before. The flames licked through aged wallpaper and dry oak beams, climbing fast. Firefighters arrived too late to save much of anything. Clara stood barefoot on the scorched floor, the smoke still clinging to her skin. The fire chief handed her a melted picture frame, its glass warped like tears. "Faulty wiring, most likely," he said. "But it's odd. The rest of the house didn't catch. Almost like it was targeted." Targeted. The word turned in her stomach like a blade. Clara hadn't told anyone about the will. Not Lenora, not even the lawyer. Only that she'd found something important. So who knew? Who else had a reason to see it destroyed? She began cataloging enemies, allies, and those in between. The town's elite had the most to lose if Lenora was legitimized. Their secrets were tangled in the Whitmores' legacy of extortion and manipulation. And then there was the question of the well. That damn well. Had someone silenced Martha Kincaid to keep her from confirming Lenora's birth, and now tried to burn the only proof of the revised inheritance? Clara confronted Lenora that evening. The ash still stained her clothes. "Tell me you didn't know about the will," she said, eyes hollow. Lenora's response was immediate. "What will?" There was no flicker of guilt, no twitch of deceit, just confusion, or something perfectly rehearsed. Clara didn't know what frightened her more, the possibility that Lenora was lying, or that she wasn't, and someone else was playing a much darker game. She'd come to the manor to bury her mother, to settle affairs and leave, but now nothing was settled, and everything was on fire, literally. The legacy was disintegrating faster than the soot could settle, and Clara was beginning to realize something chilling. This wasn't about who would inherit. It was about who would survive. The fire had scarred more than just the walls of Whitmore Manor. It had scorched Clara's certainty, singed the threads of control she thought she still held. By the time the smoke cleared, nothing felt real anymore. Not the house, not the inheritance, not even the blood in her veins. The revised will was gone. The legal path forward? Obstructed. But Clara wasn't done fighting. Not for wealth, not for legacy, but for clarity, for truth. She stood in the family cemetery behind the manor, staring at 3 headstones. Her mother's, her grandmother's, and a small one marked, Infant Whitmore, 1956. The grave was empty. She knew that now. The earth held nothing but a lie. But the house still held one last secret. It was Lenora who found it. A locked compartment beneath a floorboard in the nursery, behind a dresser no one had moved in decades. Inside, a bundle of aged documents, including a birth certificate bearing Lenora's real name and a confession, handwritten and unsigned but unmistakable in tone. It wasn't her mother's voice, it was her grandmother's. "She wasn't supposed to live. I paid for the silence. Silas begged me not to lie, but the scandal would have ruined everything. I did what I had to do." Clara read the letter aloud, voice cracking like glass under pressure. The truth was all there now. How the grandmother had paid the midwife, bribed the doctor, buried the truth along with an empty casket, and raised the family fortune on a foundation of silence. But the final lines chilled her. "One day they'll come back. Blood always does. And when it does, the house will choose who stays and who burns." That was when Clara understood. The fire wasn't random. The house hadn't resisted her return. It had warned her. And now, with Lenora beside her, holding the only surviving evidence of the crime, Clara faced the crossroads every Whitmore before her had fled from: preserve the myth, or break the curse. If she stayed silent, she could claim what remained of the estate, rewrite history, blame the fire on chance, paint Lenora as an imposter, and leave with the fortune, as generations of Whitmores had done before her. Or she could release the documents, give them to the press, let the town see what truly built Whitmore Manor: deceit, racism, betrayal, and blood. It would destroy the name. The manor would likely be seized, auctioned, left to rot. But the truth would be free. Clara looked at Lenora, her sister. No longer a shadow in the margins, but flesh and blood, a woman wronged by generations of cowardice. "I won't live off of shame," Clara said quietly. Lenora nodded. "Then let's bury it for good." They set the documents ablaze together. Not in secrecy, not in panic, but in defiance. On the front lawn, in broad daylight, where everyone could see. And they filmed it, spoke into the camera, told the real story of the Whitmores. The good, the monstrous, and the truth in between. By sunset, the manor was empty. Not of things, but of ghosts. As they walked down the gravel drive, Clara glanced back one last time. The house stood still, watching. Some inheritances are passed down in dollars, others in darkness. Clara chose to break the chain, but as the wind stirred the ashes behind her, one final thought lingered in her mind. If the house could lie for decades, what else might still be hidden beneath the floorboards?